In our last video on the War of the Spanish Succession, we covered the opening moves of the conflict in 1701 between France and Austria, including Prince Eugene of Savoy's brilliant campaign in northern Italy that summer. Now the war will turn global, as the Grand Alliance reassembles its armies under the control of its new Captain General John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough. From 1702 to 1703, the armies of the Grand Alliance and the Bourbons battled one another in campaigns and sieges across theatres of war spanning from the Low Countries in the north to as far south as northern Italy. With the Bourbon armies poised to strike at Vienna in the summer of 1704, Marlborough devises an ingenious military campaign to bring the fight directly to the French and Bavarians. In this episode, we'll be covering Marlborough's famous March to the Danube and his campaign in Bavaria, culminating in the Battle of Blenheim. Following the revival of the Grand Alliance between England, the Dutch Republic and Austria on September 7, 1701, William III, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, and Stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, began making preparations for his countries to make war with France and Spain. However, William would not live to see the completion of this work. 6 months after reviving the Grand Alliance, the king suffered a serious fall from his horse after it stumbled on a mole's burrow, breaking his collarbone in the accident. On March 8, 1702, William died from pneumonia brought on by complications of his injury. While the Dutch Republic would revert to a stadtholderless period, the task of leading the 3 British kingdoms in the war to come would fall to William's sister-in-law and designated Stuart heir, Anne. The return of a Stuart monarch to the throne of the British kingdoms immediately made Queen Anne popular with her subjects, and she would serve as one of the primary faces of the Grand Alliance's war against the Bourbons. During Queen Anne's reign, much of England's foreign and domestic policy making was directed by her Privy Council and the English Parliament, signalling a major shift in the control of England's government from the monarchy towards a more modern and familiar parliamentary system. While the Queen's Privy Council and Parliament directed the country at home, command of the British armies in Europe would fall upon Anne's favourite, John Churchill, Earl of Marlborough. John Churchill was born on May 26, 1650, the second surviving son of royalists who had been impoverished following the devastating English civil wars. When his family's estates were restored during the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Churchill became associated with the Duke of York, the future King James II. By the 1670s, Churchill had entered into military life, serving as an officer in the English contingent of Louis XIV's armies during the Franco-Dutch War. Around 1675, he met Sarah Jennings, who hailed from a similar royalist gentry background. The two soon fell in love and married in the winter of 1677. Sarah Churchill was a close friend of the young Princess Anne, and would become one of the Queen's closest and most influential favourites after her ascendancy to the English throne in 1702. In 1685, shortly after the accession of James II, John Churchill led a royalist army in suppressing a revolt led by the Duke of Monmouth at the Battle of Sedgemoor. However, 3 years later, Churchill's allegiances shifted to William of Orange, and his defection to William's cause was one of the decisive factors in the success of the Glorious Revolution. During the 9 Years' War, Churchill, now elevated to Earl of Marlborough and known by his gentry title of Marlborough, participated in the Battle of Welcourt in 1689. In 1690, he led a campaign to seize the Irish Jacobite strongholds of Cork and Kinsale. Despite their support for the Williamite cause, the Churchills were held in low regard by William's wife, Queen Mary II, who distrusted them for Marlborough's reported Jacobite leanings and communications with the exiled King James. This mistrust eventually led to Marlborough's fall from office in 1692, and even brief imprisonment in the Tower of London. After his release from the Tower, Marlborough remained out of office during the rest of William and Mary's reign. Still, by 1701, as tensions between the great powers made war seem inevitable, William reconciled with Marlborough and appointed him commander of English army forces in preparation for a possible conflict with France. With William's death, Marlborough's close association with Queen Anne secured his appointment as Captain General of Her Majesty's forces in Europe. When England and the Dutch Republic formally declared war on France on May 4, 1702, Marlborough was further elevated to Captain General of the Grand Alliance armies in Europe, despite his inexperience commanding large armies. He would now become the de facto military leader of the Grand Alliance in its war against Louis XIV. During the winter of 1701 to 1702, the French began actively preparing for war with the English and Dutch. On April 18, 1702, the campaign in the Low Countries theatre began, when a Dutch and German army of 16,000 men, led by Field Marshal Valrad, Prince of Nassau-Usingen, besieged the fortress town of Kaiserwerth on the Lower Rhine. A second Dutch army, commanded by Geudert de Ginkel, Earl of Athlone, served as a covering force for the besiegers. By capturing this key fortress, the Allies could open the Rhine as far south as Cologne. It would also encourage the still neutral German states of the Holy Roman Empire to support the Allied cause. After 2 months, on June 15th, the siege of Kaiserwerth ended with the fortress's capitulation to the Allies. On July 2nd, Marlborough departed The Hague to join the Allied army at Nijmegen, and to make final preparations for his Allied offensive against the enemy fortresses on the Meuse. His armies finally moved out in late July, and over the next 3 months proceeded to besiege and capture the fortresses of Venlo, Rieremonde and Liège. The fall of Liège marks the conclusion of the 1702 campaign in the Low Countries, and Marlborough returned to England that November. Marlborough's successes on the Meuse undid many of the French gains in the region over the past 10 years, and as a show of thanks for his string of victories, Queen Anne elevated him from the rank of Earl to Duke. While Marlborough's forces were making gains in the Low Countries that year, campaigns were also being undertaken on other fronts and in other theatres of the war. In northern Italy, on February 1st, Prince Eugene of Savoy's imperialist army commenced its 1702 campaign by storming the fortified village of Cremona and capturing the French army of Italy's commander, Marshal François de Neufville, Duke of Villeroy. Villeroy's replacement, Marshal Louis-Joseph, Duke of Vendôme, would prove more of Eugene's equal, and the 1702 Italian campaign would devolve into a state of guerrilla warfare. Later in the year, Eugene was recalled to Vienna, and he left command of his army to General Count Guido von Starhemberg. A year later, in October 1703, Victor Amadeus II, Duke of Savoy, would defect to the Grand Alliance, betraying the Bourbons and shifting the primary focus of the Italian theatre to the Piedmont and Lombardy regions. The Allies also saw success in Spain, where at the Battle of Vigo Bay on October 23, 1702, an Anglo-Dutch fleet, commanded by Admiral George Rooke, caught and destroyed a Franco-Spanish treasure fleet anchored in Vigo Bay. The victory here persuaded the Kingdom of Portugal to switch its allegiances to the Allied cause. Although the Grand Alliance had seen a string of victories in 1702, the next year would see a reversal of their fortunes. For the 1703 campaign season, King Louis ordered the focal point of the French war effort for that year to be concentrated in the Upper Rhine theatre. That spring, French Marshal Claude Louis-Hector de Villars, Duke of Villars, advanced through the Black Forest with the intent of capturing Vienna. Villars successfully manoeuvred through the Danube Valley, and with the support of his Bavarian allies, prevented the Margrave of Baden's imperialist army from linking up with the forces of Hermann Otto von Limburg-Stirum, defeating them at the Battle of Munderkingen on July 31st, and then at Höchstädt on September 20th. The Battle of Höchstädt had been a great victory for the Bourbons, who inflicted 4,500 casualties on the Imperialists at the cost of just around 1,000 Franco-Bavarian troops. Villars urged for continued aggression and to drive on to Vienna and capture the Austrian capital before the onset of winter. Still, his timid and overcautious Bavarian ally, Elector Maximilian II, refused to comply. Villars resigned his command in disgust. The end of campaigning in 1703 put the Allies in a precarious situation. The Bourbons were posed to capture Vienna in a grand offensive during the 1704 campaign season if something wasn't done to prevent this move. The loss of Vienna would knock the Austrians out of the war, dealing a great blow to the Allied war effort. For the French offensive against Austria in 1704, Louis ordered the French army in Flanders, commanded by the repatriated Marshal Villeroy, to remain on the defensive, while an army under Marshal Camille d'Estaing, Duke of Tillard, advanced across the Rhine. Marshal Ferdinand de Marsan and the Bavarian Elector would move through the Danube Valley, while the French army of Italy attacked Tyrol. In August 1704, French forces invaded southern Germany with the support of Hungarian rebels. The fortress cities of Augsburg, Regensburg and Landau fell to the advancing Bourbon forces, and Emperor Leopold appealed to Queen Anne to send forces to his country's aid. The Queen in turn looked to the Duke of Marlborough to devise a plan of action. Marlborough had initially devised an offensive into the Moselle River Valley, but the dire threat to Vienna caused him to switch up his plans. He would now take his Anglo-Dutch army out of the Low Countries and move it into Germany and the Danube Valley. The plan was bold, daring and risky. It presented formidable logistical challenges, and the fact that he would be marching his army 480 kilometers in the face of the enemy made the prospects of success all the more daunting. But Marlborough knew that something had to be done, or soon Vienna would certainly fall to the Bourbons. The Dutch States General, for their part, opposed any large movement that would leave their country vulnerable to invasion. So Marlborough instead presented his plan as simply an offensive thrust towards the Moselle to draw away Bavarian pressure from Holland's doorstep. He omitted the fact that he had no intention of stopping before reaching the Danube. Marlborough and his political ally Sidney Godolphin, Lord High Treasurer of England, spent the early winter of 1704 making vigorous preparations for the ambitious campaign scheduled to begin that spring. Logistical depots were set up in advance along the planned route of the march, and supplies were carefully prepared all the way down to the replacement shoes the troops would wear during the arduous march. His route was also pathed out to mislead the French into pursuing him, rather than reinforcing Maximilian. On May 20th, 1704, Marlborough's army of 21,000 men, of which 16,000 were British troops, started their march across the Meuse via a hastily constructed pontoon bridge at Ruramonde. His army comprised 51 foot battalions and 92 horse squadrons, with 34 field artillery pieces and 4 howitzers, more of which would be picked up along the way. 5 days after setting out, the army arrived at their first supply depot at Koblenz. In order to deceive the French, Marlborough followed an unorthodox marching routine. The men were awoken between 1 to 2 a.m. and marched at full speed to the next arranged depot. There they would draw rations, pitch tents, and rest for the remainder of the day. Despite the meticulous planning and the stop-and-go nature of the march to keep the men fresh, troops would still fall out of formation in droves from the grueling march. On June 3rd, the army crossed the main river near Kassel and proceeded to the Neckar River. Then they advanced into the Danube Valley, reaching Ulm. On June 10th, Marlborough met for the first time with Prince Eugene of Savoy at the village of Mundelsheim, halfway between the Danube and the Rhine. The two immediately took a liking to one another, and it would prove to be the beginning of a great military partnership. 3 days later, the Margrave of Baden joined them at Fross-Heppach. On June 22nd, Marlborough's army reached Elkingen, having marched over 480 kilometers in 5 weeks of marching. The next day, the armies of Marlborough, Eugene and Baden effected a junction on the Danube, bringing their combined army strength up to 110,000 men. The three generals decided that Prince Eugene would take 28,000 men to the defensive lines of Stollhofen on the Rhine in order to watch Villeroy and Tallard and prevent their two armies from linking up with the Bavarians. Meanwhile, Marlborough and Baden, with 80,000 men, would combine forces for a decisive march to the Danube, where they would seek battle with Maximilian and Marshal Marsan before they could be reinforced. The French marshals in the theatre began devising a plan to save Maximilian's army. Tallard would reinforce Marsan and Maximilian on the Danube by moving through the Black Forest with 40-foot battalions and 50 horse squadrons. Villeroy would pin down Eugene's forces at the lines of Stollhofen, and if the Allies continued moving to the Danube, he would effect a junction with Tallard and General François de Coigny in order to protect Alsace. On July 1st, Tallard's army of 35,000 recrossed the Rhine and started its march. Meanwhile, Maximilian and Marsan had gathered a force of 55,000 men at Ulm, which would be reinforced by Tallard's columns for the invasion. The Allies now needed a base for supplies and to safely cross the Danube. On July 2nd, Marlborough and Baden's forces stormed the Bavarian stronghold of Schellenberg, situated on the heights above the fortified village of Donauwörth. Pressed for time, Marlborough had ordered an all-out tactical assault on the Bavarian position. Following a ferocious and bloody day-long battle, Schellenberg fell to the Allied armies. The Allies had lost 5,374 men in the assault, while the Franco-Bavarians had suffered even higher casualties. After their victory at the Battle of Schellenberg, the Allied armies advanced into Bavaria. Marlborough had sensed that Maximilian's loyalties to Louis were wavering, and so throughout July, the Duke ordered his troops to conduct a scorched earth campaign to force the Bavarians out of the war. Crops and farms were burned by the Allied troops in a brutal type of warfare not experienced in these lands since the 30 Years' War. The Allies took special care to burn the Elector's personal lands and possessions. The terrified Bavarians in the countryside fled for safety in the cities, taking all their belongings with them. Just as expected, Maximilian began to waver in his allegiance to Louis. However, Tallard sent a dispatch to the Elector informing him that he was en route through the Black Forest to link up and take the fight to the Allied invaders. Marlborough's hopes of negotiating with the Elector would prove wasteful, as the arrival of Tallard's forces in the region fortified Maximilian's resolve. Marlborough thus intensified the burning of Bavarian lands, with some 372 towns, villages and farmhouses demolished in the harsh campaign of destruction. Marlborough soon received word that Prince Eugene had left 12,000 men on the lines of Stolhofen and was en route to rendezvous with the Allied army in Bavaria. Both Marlborough and Eugene hoped to bring the enemy armies to battle. On August 12th, the armies united at the village of Höchstädt. Marlborough dispatched Baden, who had proven to be troublesome, to besiege Ingolstadt with 15,000 men, reducing the Allied army to about 56,000. The Franco-Bavarian army, under the command of Tallard and Maximilian, would outnumber them slightly, and took up positions on the south bank of the Nebel River. They did not expect the Allies to make an attack on their position, and Tallard confidently sent a letter to King Louis stating he believed the Allies would retire to Nordlingen. This would prove a grave miscalculation on the French marshal's part. Marlborough and Prince Eugene spent the morning of August 13th meticulously preparing their forces to do battle on the north bank of the Nebel. The Franco-Bavarian army was protected to the south by the Danube, and wooded hills on their left guarded from any outflanking movement in that direction. The marshy Nebel provided a formidable barrier to any frontal assault, and the heavily fortified village of Blenheim, known to the British as Blenheim, anchored the Franco-Bavarian right flank. Tallard deployed his army on a wide floodplain between Blenheim on the right and Lutzingen on his left, roughly 35 kilometers apart. In their center was another fortified village, Oberglau. On the Allied right, Eugene faced Maximilian's army between Lutzingen and Oberglau, while Marlborough's forces opposed Tallard's army at Oberglau and Blenheim. At 2 a.m. on the morning of August 13, 1704, a vanguard of 40 horse squadrons was sent forward towards the enemy lines. An hour later, the main Allied force, arranged into 9 columns, followed up and pushed towards the Nebel. Mist obscured the Allies' march, giving them an enormous advantage. Eugene and Marlborough met at the former's tent at 6 a.m. to finalize preparations before separating their armies into 2 wings. Marlborough, with 36,000 men, would attack Tallard's equal-sized force on the left bank, while Prince Eugene, with 16,000 men, would battle Maximilian and Masson's combined army of 24,000 on the right wing. At 7 a.m, the morning fog lifted, revealing the massed Allied battle lines to the astonished Franco-Bavarian commanders. The French and Bavarians proceeded to deploy with infantry in the center and cavalry on the wings, with the 2 cavalry wings meeting at Oberglau. The Battle of Blenheim, known to the French as the Second Battle of Höchstädt, commenced with an Allied artillery bombardment of the Franco-Bavarian lines at 7 o'clock that morning. Actual fighting began at 12:30 p.m, when Lord John Cutts attacked the village of Blenheim with his British and German battalions. The fortified village was a formidable obstacle for Marlborough's forces, but Lord Cutts's battalions executed a solid attack on Blenheim. 4 brigades of infantry, 2 English, 1 Hessian and 1 Hanoverian, assaulted the village under a hail of musketry to reach the barricaded walls and streets. The English redcoats of Howe's regiment of foot led the way, stabbing holes through the overturned wagons, furniture and other impromptu barricades. They fired over the parapets, and even attempted to tear down the barricades with their hands. French reserves, including an elite unit of heavy cavalry gendarmes, arrived and managed to push the Allied battalions back from their first assault. The battalion of Scots Fusiliers lost its colours in the fighting, but a volley by their Hessian allies killed many of the gendarmes, and allowed the Scots to reclaim their lost standard. After Lord Cutts began his attack on Blenheim, Marlborough and Eugene commenced their general advance all along the line. Marlborough had arranged his army in an unusual tactical formation. He ordered his brother, Charles Churchill, to arrange the infantry in 2 lines, with the first of 17 battalions to lead the attack across the Nebel. The second line of 11 battalions would follow close behind. In between the infantry rode 71 squadrons of cavalry, also divided into 2 lines, with the total force numbering 23,000 men. Marlborough's pioneers repaired the damaged footbridge over the Nebel at Unterglau on the Allied left centre, while another 5 mobile pontoon bridges were laid between Unterglau and Blenheim. The Franco-Bavarians repulsed individual Allied probing attacks on Blenheim, Oberglau and Lutzingen. Still, the Bourbon forces were pinned enough to allow Marlborough to launch cavalry contingents across the stream and attack the enemy units caught in the open ground between Blenheim and Lutzingen. In Marlborough's centre, the Allies began crossing the stream, first with the foot battalions and then the horse squadrons. Caught by surprise, Tallard belatedly ordered a cavalry charge by the same gendarmes units bloodied from the action at Blenheim. The French cavalry attacked vigorously, but the English and Dutch horse troopers stood firm, deploying into 3 groups and falling upon the French flanks and rear. Tallard watched with dismay as the Redcoats cut down his vaunted cavalry units. Once across the Nebel, Marlborough deployed his men with 2 lines of infantry behind 2 lines of cavalry, permitting them to repel repeated French cavalry charges. The Allies were still taking heavy cannon fire from the French and Bavarian guns, and at one point Marlborough was almost hit by a cannonball while leading his men from the front of the action. As Marlborough was leading his men across the Nebel, Prince Eugene launched an assault from the Allied right flank. However, the rough ground in this sector prevented him from making much headway. At 3 p.m, the French launched a bloody counterattack at Oberglau, spearheaded by the Wild Geese, regiments of expatriated Irish soldiers serving in the French ranks who hated the English. Marlborough wrote a dispatch to Eugene calling for reinforcements. While Eugene was having his own troubles, he immediately ordered his Austrian cuirassiers to charge into the French flank and repel the breakthrough. The French counterattack soon fizzled out with heavy losses. By 5:30 p.m, after firing a concentrated artillery barrage with 40 cannons, Marlborough effected a breakthrough in Tallard's centre. Reinforcements were soon pouring through the breach in the French line, while in Prince Eugene's sector, Maximilian and Masson kept their side of the line stabilised. However, Eugene's concentrated attacks on the Franco-Bavarians prevented them from reinforcing Tallard's sector. With Tallard's line broken, Masson and Maximilian began to fall back towards Oberglau, leaving Tallard's forces cut off in the face of another heavy cavalry charge by Marlborough's squadrons. Marlborough's troops swept around the rear of Blenheim, threatening to cut off the French garrison inside. Finally, 24 battalions of French infantry and 4 regiments of dragoons surrendered to Marlborough's forces. Among the surrendered French forces was Marshal Tallard himself, who had been wounded and captured in the confusion. Masson and Maximilian, meanwhile, set fire to Oberglau and Lutzingen and retreated to the northwest. The Battle of Blenheim was over, and the defeat of the Franco-Bavarians was complete. Marlborough hastily scribbled a dispatch to his wife Sarah, which began with, "I have not time to say more, but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." The Battle of Blenheim was a decisive Allied victory, and it was followed by the conquest of territory in Bavaria and southern Germany. After the battle and its subsequent retreat to the Rhine, the Franco-Bavarian army was largely ineffective. When he finally received word of the defeat, King Louis became quite depressed. The Battle of Blenheim had shattered the myth of the French army's invincibility that had been shaped over the past 50 years. The threat against Austria had been eliminated, the tide of the war had turned in the Allies' favour, and Marlborough would use the momentum gained at Blenheim to seize the initiative from the French. This is episode 3 of our YouTube member and Patreon exclusive series on the War of Spanish Succession. Our kind members and patrons have access to 8 episodes on this epic conflict that changed the fate of Europe and beyond. All significant battles are covered, including Oudenarde, Ramillies, Almansa and Malplaquet, with more to come in the extended video.
If you want to see the rest of the series on the Spanish succession, as well as more than 250 other exclusive videos, including the continuation of Spanish succession in the War of Austrian Succession, as well as the Persian Wars, Punic Wars, Reconquista, Eastern, North African and Pacific fronts of World War II, and more, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job.
Make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly patron and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.